Liverpool Street, Britain's busiest railway station. Cheek by jowl with Spitalfields, an interesting historic area just on the edge of the City of London. Let's go and take a look at what it has to offer on the pub front. I know some of you will of course say that I should have stopped in at the Hamilton Hall, the Wetherspoons pub that's sort of part of Liverpool Station itself. It's currently closed for some refurbishment work for a few weeks. I think it opens end of May. I have been here before, of course, covered that in the Wetherspoons video. I'll put a link to that up in the corner if you haven't already seen it. Pub number 1, Dirty Dick's. Cheers from Dirty Dick's. This is quite a famous pub with an unusual name, and we'll get into the origin of that later. Let's take a look at the exterior first. It's a tall, fairly slender building in yellow stock brick with some stucco decoration extending to 5 or 6 stories. The pub frontage extends over the ground and first floors. The neon sign is quite an unusual touch for a historic pub, although we will see another one of those later. The first floor window is flanked with pilasters topped with busts. Are these perhaps supposed to be Nathaniel Bentley and his fiancée? And we'll get on to who they are later. The second and third floor windows have shield motifs above them, which is intriguing. More intriguing, the top floor. There is a pair of Gothic arches, and they sprout from these elaborate Corinthian or possibly composite capitals. Nestled above those is a roundel, and in that a stucco carving which may relate to the pub's former name, the Old Jerusalem. Does this depict one of the churches in Jerusalem, possibly? And there is also some access to the side from Swedeland Court, which I think was actually given as this pub's address for some period of time. Inside, I would say there's not a huge amount to look at today in terms of original fixtures and fittings. It is sort of gratifyingly woody, and they've kept a sort of warehousey kind of feel to it. There's some matchboard panelling in places, and a lot of exposed brickwork and some rather substantial beams supporting the interior. Alas, very few, if any, artefacts from Dirty Dick's original collection still remain today. There is one slightly sorry looking cabinet by the toilets, and even that is a little bit of a shadow of its former self. If you look at some older photos of that, you can still see things like dead cats in there. Presumably they have since been removed for health and safety reasons, so there are just a few odd trinkets in there, a copper kettle and so on. There is a sort of gallery area on the first floor which looks down onto the ground floor. That's a nice feature, I suppose. So even though we may not be able to get a huge sense of it today, it is a pub with quite a colourful history. The pub is apparently named for Nathaniel Bentley, known as Dirty Dick. He lived from around 1735 to 1809. He was a merchant who ran a shop or possibly warehouse on Leadenhall Street, not too far from here. The story goes that his fiancée died on what would have been their wedding day, and after that he refused ever to wash again or to allow his house to be cleaned. There is a newspaper mention of 1804 about the shop or warehouse that Nathaniel Bentley ran on Leadenhall Street, at which point it seems to have turned into more of a museum or tourist attraction. Note the warning to ladies to wear something other than their best clothes because of the risk of them getting dirty. The contents of his famously dirty premises were apparently moved to the pub, including a collection of dead cats. Alas, as I say, as far as I can tell, few or any artefacts from that era still remain in the pub today. There is a directory listing of 1874, and at that time it appears to still refer to this pub as the Old Jerusalem. However, confusingly, also a newspaper mention of 1874, and it looks like the owners of Dirty Dick's were trying to start a chain. There's an interesting note there that part of the conditions of which the Bishopsgate, this one, Dirty Dick's branch, had been bequeathed were that it must never be cleaned and no person must be served twice. In 1881, Tavern Anecdotes and Sayings has several pages on Dirty Dick's. This suggests that the no person to be served twice rule is something of a gimmick and a bit of a sales tactic. This rule was frequently flouted, and it was typical for customers to simply leave by one door, come in by another, and when asked if they would like another, they would say, "No, I don't want the same drink, but I would like something similar to that which was served to the gentleman gentleman who left by that exit over there. There's also a suggestion in that book of 1881 that the building had been recently rebuilt at that time. So my guess is the building that we're looking at today probably dates to roughly the 1870s. This photo was probably taken in the 1890s or the early 1900s, and you can see the frontage looking very similar to how it does today, particularly that stucco up on the top floor, which may or may not depict a scene from Jerusalem. A newspaper mention in 1899 still appears to refer to it as the Old Jerusalem. I got the sense from at least one newspaper mention that it may officially have been called the Old Jerusalem for some period of time, and Dirty Dick's may have been more of a nickname. It's operated by Young's today, although to their credit they did have a slightly more interesting than the usual Young's pub lineup. There was Harvey's Sussex Best Bitter on the bar, but alas that was off at the time of my visit, so I just went for a half of London Original, which came in at £2.90. Pub number 2, the Williams Ale and Cider House. Cheers from the Williams Ale and Cider House. This is my first time in here, and I have to admit I had walked past this a couple of times and something about the name just made me dismiss it as a modern pub. It is actually quite historic, and to some of you at least, more interestingly than that, it has an impressive selection of beers. I counted 7 hand pumps for beers and 7 hand pumps for ciders. I've gone for a half of Moor Stout. This building is not listed, so we don't have any notes from Historic England, and it's not on camera's list of historic pub interiors. I don't think there's much about the interior that is preserved, but I would guess, looking at the exterior, that it's a 19th century building, somewhere in the 19th century, possibly even late Georgian, could be early 19th century. It has 2 entrances today. There's this narrow window in the middle, flanked by 2 bay windows, and I'm almost inclined to think that possibly this narrow window in the middle was at one point a 3rd entrance. Note also the FP 11-foot plate over on the right hand side of the frontage, just above the ground floor. Is that some sort of fire insurance plate, possibly? Not quite sure. So inside, again, I don't think there is a lot of original interior fabric here today. There's some fielded panelling towards the back of the pub, and there seem to be no fewer than 3 dartboards. I can't think of another pub that I've seen more than 1 dartboard, let alone 3. There's a nice collection of sort of old pots and tankards on a shelf up above the bar counter. I thought that was a nice touch. And there's also a couple of other knickknacks here and there. There is a small display case with old smoking paraphernalia and a few prints and things dotted around, so at least some effort has been made to make this feel pubby. Of course, the main draw here will be what's on the bar counter, those 7 hand pumps of ale, 7 hand pumps of cider. So it is a surprisingly old pub, or at least a pub on this site, goes back some way. I found a newspaper mention of it in its guise as the Ship, its former name, in 1797, addressing master carpenters. The modern name probably comes from the fact that it seems to have been ran by a succession of members of the Williams family from the 1850s roughly to the 1930s. And I think during that time it was a bit more of a sort of wine and spirits merchant, which is actually quite similar to how Dirty Dick's was trading during most of the 19th century. There may have been other parallels with Dirty Dick's, as recounted in an 1893 book titled Round London, Down East and Up West by Montague Williams. Not sure if it's just a coincidence that we have another Williams there. In the book, Montague Williams espouses this as a model of a public house for doing its bit to stamp out drunkenness. It was known simply as 14 Artillery Lane at that time. Like Dirty Dick's, it had a set of rules, including that no customer is to be supplied with more than 1 drink unless they leave the premises for at least half an hour. I like to imagine that they spent that time round the corner at Dirty Dick's. You can see it here marked on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, and again on the mid-1900s Ordnance Survey map, at which time it is still called the Ship. Perhaps not a huge amount to talk about on the history front of this pub, but I do think it's one to include if you're doing a tour of the area for the selection of ales and ciders. Pub number 3, the 10 Bells. Cheers from the 10 Bells. A lot of road traffic noise here, sorry, you're probably not going to be able to hear me very well, but this is a listed building. It is also on camera's list of historic pub interiors, so we have a lot of material to go on here. I was here 10 years ago or something, and I remember it feeling a lot more kind of modern and sort of, hipsterified, but somehow, perhaps because it's quiet when I'm here right now, it's 2 o'clock on a weekday afternoon, nice and quiet, and I can really appreciate that beautiful tiled interior. So taking a look at the exterior first, starting at the top floor, there is a balustraded parapet, and it's got a sort of an empty arch, which tantalizingly suggests at some point there must have been some carving in there. Mixture of curved and triangular pedimented windows, they sort of alternate on the lower floors. The ground floor frontage still shows some of the Truman's signage. We are very much in Truman's territory here. The Brick Lane Brewery is meters away from here, so we're very much on their turf. Pink granite pilasters along the frontage. Alas, Ruth Siddall hasn't visited here, so I don't have a definitive identification for which type of granite. If it's pink, it's usually either Swedish coastal or it's from Aberdeenshire. I'm inclined slightly more to the latter. Those pilasters along the frontage have composite capitals with faces in them. Not sure if there's supposed to be a particular meaning to those faces, but I would say overall, given that use of possibly Swedish, possibly Aberdeen granite, then this is likely an 1890s or early 1900s frontage to an older building. Historic England believe this to be a mid-19th century building. A total of 3 entrances now. They all have some sort of ironwork over the top. The primary reason for the inclusion on camera's list of historic pub interiors are the wall tiles. They actually cover almost the entire inside of the pub. The most noticeable of that is this depiction titled Spitalfields in the Olden Time, or Ye Olden Time, visiting a weaver's shop. Definitely smacks of merry old England, and there's not much historical accuracy in the costumes, etc. there, but it is an interesting segue to talk a little bit about the history of this area, Spitalfields. It was, as the name suggests, largely fields until the major wave of development started towards the end of the 17th century, and the Huguenots, those refugees from France, set up shop here as silk weavers. This became the main hub for England's silk weaving industry. Part of the reason for choosing Spitalfields as the location was that it was just outside the city walls, the City of London, and therefore that they wouldn't be controlled by the guilds. As an aside, my mum has just become a member of one of those guilds. She's been admitted to the Guild of Framework Knitters, so at some point she may have the right to drive herds of sheep over London Bridge, or whatever rights it is that confers. The name, the 10 Bells, comes from the neighbouring church, which is Christ Church in Spitalfields, and that possibly today or possibly at some point in the past has 10 bells in its tower. It hasn't always had 10 bells. I believe the number of bells has fluctuated, and the pub has tried to keep in step with that. At some point in the past it was called the 8 Bells. Sunfire Office insurance records go back to the 1790s. At that point it was still the 10 bells, but not long before that I found a newspaper mention from 1788 where it was referred to as the 8 Bells. And going a little bit further back in 1784, you can also see that there was a meeting of a Masonic lodge here. I've always found that interest people seem to have in Jack the Ripper and all the Whitechapel murders a bit weird, to be honest, but it's worth noting this pub is very much associated with that sorry period of history. Mary Jane Kelly, I believe this was the last place she was seen alive. Today, I think this is a somewhat independent pub, or it's run by a very small pub co. They had Southwold Bitter on the bar. I had a half of that. Pub number 4, the Golden Heart. Cheers from the Golden Heart. This is a terrible place to try and do any recording because next to a busy road again, but anyway, I'll do my best. Another listed building, although it's only listed in 2015. The current building dates to around 1935 and was built for Truman's Brewery. The architect was Arthur Edward Sewell, who we've encountered a few times before in these videos, the in-house architect for Truman's. It's neo-Georgian in style, as a lot of these improved public houses built by Truman's in that interwar period were, and it's mainly red brick, but with some Portland stone decoration and some faience tiling to the ground floor. It also has a very rare surviving example of an original 1930s neon sign. On the second floor, you can see a roundel containing the eagle, which is the logo for the Truman's Brewery, in a panel that also has the name of the pub. It looks to me as though there were originally 3 entrances to this pub. Now only 2 are in service. Both the Historic England listing and cameras listing for the interior mention that there were originally actually 5 distinct spaces: a private bar, a public bar and a saloon bar, but the saloon bar and the public bar also had a dining area. That public bar was the only one that was open on my visit, although confusingly the door for that says saloon bar. The other door that still exists is unmarked, so I assume they've been swapped round at some point. The counter here has matchboard panelling, the walls have fielded panelling, and this space also expands a little bit into what was previously the private bar. There's a central servery that serves both the saloon bar today and the public bar. On the other side, which we're not able to see today, the bar counter apparently has fielded panelling rather than matchboard panelling, and we've seen that distinction before at the Old Justice in Rotherhithe, another interwar pub. There seemed to be the sense that matchboard panelling was a little bit more down market, fielded panelling a little bit more upmarket, so if you wanted to make a distinction in the interior style between the public bar and the saloon bar, that was one way to do it. There are bits of quite attractive stained glass dotted throughout the interior of the pub, and there are also some bits of Truman's livery inside the pub detailing the different kinds of beer on offer. Also lots of arched brick fireplaces throughout this pub. I think there are 3 in what is now the public bar and possibly more in the saloon bar side I wasn't able to see. The history of the pub is slightly confused by the fact that I think at some point in the 19th century at least there was another pub here in Spitalfields also called the Golden Hart. That was over on Phoenix Street, which is quite some distance from this location, which is on the corner of Hanbury Street and Commercial Street. Those 2 streets were originally known as Red Lion Street and Brown's Lane. From about the 1880s onwards, I was able to find some newspaper references for this pub that seem to identify it as being at this location in 1882, in 1898 and in 1919. You can also see it marked on Gode's map of 1887 with a PH. In the 1990s, it became a hub for artists associated with the Young British Artist Group, an era that's also sometimes referred to as Brit Art. I suppose that's a riff on Brit pop. The pub had echoes of Soho's Colony Room Club, and it similarly had a very characterful landlady at the helm, Sandra Esquilant. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, and she was considered as a sort of mother confessor to that generation of artists. Tracy Emin described her as so generous, I've never heard her say anything bad about anybody ever, which I guess means that the parallels between her and Muriel Belcher at the Colony Room Club fall somewhat flat at that point. Gilbert and George were also regulars here, although of course they were already well into their 50s by the peak of the Young British Artist period in the 1990s, so I don't think they could really be included in that group. They do, however, have today a gallery which is located next door to the next pub that we're going to go to, which makes a good segue to there. But first, I think this is an independent pub today. They had Timothy Taylor's landlord as the only functioning hand pump on the bar, so I went for a half of that. Pub number 5, the Pride of Spitalfields. Cheers from the Pride of Spitalfields. Quite an unusual pub building. It's 2 stories, almost 1.5 stories. The upper floor only expands over about half of the width of the building. It's got this slightly unusual curved gable at the top formed by a brick arch, and it looks like that was originally flanked by 2 ball finials. Only one of those now remains on the right hand side. A little lower down on that first floor, that half of the first floor, there is an old Fuller's sign. The upper floor is in pebble dash style plaster, and the ground floor has whitewash brick. There are these blue awnings over all of the windows. Inside, it's an absolute gem of a pub. I doubt that the interior has changed very much since probably the 1980s at least. It still has a carpet, wonderfully. I love pubs with carpets. There is a curved bar counter with matchboard panelling. There is a balustraded gantry above the bar counter, and that has a collection of ceramic jugs and bottles, red banquette seating around the walls. Towards the back there is a serving hatch with another awning inside that reads Mary's pantry. I think they serve sandwiches and stuff from there. Also a piano tucked away in one corner. One aspect of the interior that particularly caught my eye is this mirror over the fireplace. This is a camera, a Campaign for Real Ale mirror, and it dates to, I believe, either the late 1970s or the early 1980s. And the reason I know this is because I have one myself at home. I don't know if I've ever mentioned on the channel before, but I actually grew up in a pub. My parents were very early members of the Campaign for Real Ale, and I believe they knew the designer who designed this beautiful mirror. It is a treasured possession of mine. You can still see vestiges of the pub's former name. Behind the bar on the bar back, still the name Romford Arms, and there's also a mirror that gives a bit of a hint to that. It's an Ind coupe mirror with Romford Ales written on it. The pub was formerly known as the Romford Arms, purportedly because they served beer from the Star Brewery in Romford, which eventually became part of Ind coupe. The story goes that the pub changed its name in the mid-1980s because the pub at that point severed its ties with the Star Brewery and instead started to serve London Pride, thus Pride of Spitalfields. Not sure if that's true or not. At least one guy at the bar just now seemed to think that that may not be the reason behind it, but it's a nice story. If true, then that would be quite a rare example of a pub named after a beer. It's not marked on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. I wonder if that's possibly because it looks like this may have originally been a beer house, and we've seen examples of that before where they don't get the same kind of level of recognition that full public houses would. Note on that 1890s Ordnance Survey map, the brewery, this was apparently John Turner and Sons, and that was dissolved in 1890, and I managed to find a newspaper record attesting to that. My sense is that possibly the Romford Arms that we now know as the Pride of Spitalfield was originally the brewery tap for that brewery, possibly even nameless at that time, and then sometime after the 1890 dissolution of that brewery, it struck out by itself as simply a beer house. The earliest records I could find for it are not long after 1890, including this newspaper mention from 1903. I particularly like here the word burglariously. It is today, I believe, a free house and independent pub. Hopefully can show you a quick shot of the beers on the bar. Quite well regarded for its real ale. I think it has won some awards from camera over the years. I'm fittingly having a half of London Pride when in Rome and all that. Okay, well that's it for today here from Brick Lane. I shall sign off. Hope that's been of some interest, this tour of Spitalfields. Going to be taking a little bit of a break from the videos for a week or two. In the not too distant future, I will see you on the next one.